Hi, this lecture is about the Lindbergh kidnapping. I'm Jerry Kroth. I'm a associate professor emeritus from Santa Clara University. I'm a psychologist, and I was always intrigued about the Lindbergh story because it really is a story about mob psychology and collective psychology, which is kind of my area of interest. In 1932, the kidnapped baby of Charles Lindbergh became one of the biggest stories in the country. Um, a couple of years later, a guy named Bruno Richard Hauptmann was uh, captured and ultimately executed for the crime. Now, this execution really involved mass psychology, mob rule, the collective unconscious, and terms like numinosity, all of which we're going to get into. This kind of divided into two parts: a story about the nature of the story of Lindbergh and the kidnapping, and then followed that by a psychological interpretation of all of this stuff, which it certainly deserves. So let's begin with the concept of numinosity. Jung and Freud, you can have two kinds of dreams. If you have a Freudian dream or even a Jungian one, you forget it often in the morning. That's stuff that usually is emotional material you have not processed, which is one of the reasons you allegedly forget it. There's another class of dreams, however, that are unforgettable, that are vivid, that are remembered for your entire life. Jung talked about those vivid dreams as numinous, uh, bright, vivid, unforgettable. It's as if they sear themselves into your brains. That happens at the collective stage too. When people who were over the age of 6 uh, heard about the Kennedy assassination, they remembered where they were, who they were with, what they were doing. They sort of imprinted their exact location in space and time for that event. The same thing kind of happened in 9/11. People remembered who they were with, how they heard it, where they were, and it was an imprinting moment. This is a numinous moment to Jung. So what happens at an individual stage for a dreamer often happens at a collective stage for a people. So this story begins in 1927 with a young mid-20s guy who likes flying and is also very intelligent, says, I think I could put together a plane that could make it a single person event. And if one person could fly across the Atlantic, they would win $25,000. And he thought he could win the $25,000. And his investors put up the money for the Spirit of St. Louis, and off he went. He didn't realize that he was entering into an envelope, into a vacuum, a vortex that would consume him. His life would never be the same after he landed in Paris. So here's Charles getting ready for his flight. And he was a handsome young man, and off he went, flying across the Atlantic. He flew over Ireland. By the time he landed in Paris, this is when it started. This is when mob rule started. 100,000 people came out to see Charles Lindbergh. They picked him up and carried him around for half an hour before he could touch down. Okay, when he came back to the United States, there was a ticker day uh, parade for him. Almost half the entire population of New York City came out to see him. He didn't own a suit, so they had to get him a suit. And he came to the White House and gave a speech. It was like a paragraph long, and everything he seemed to do just made him more and more famous. When he made his single speech at the White House, people thought, oh my God, this is like Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. So one writer said, Charles Lindbergh became the most famous person in the world. And there's a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that that was true. He didn't expect any of this. He didn't want any of this. So uh, people didn't talk about mass hysteria. This was in this era of the flappers in the 20s, and speculation and gambling and a lack of inhibition. And Charles Lindbergh was very much the opposite of that. He was very stoic and very moralistic about his own personal behavior. So that contributed to everything. Charles Lindbergh received 100,000 telegrams and 3.5 million letters. This is in 1927 now. Okay, he was a mountain was named after Charles Lindbergh, and he was given a offer of $1 million for a cigarette endorsement. He wasn't rich at all. He came from Michigan. His mother was a school teacher. He turned down the $1 million offer for a cigarette commercial because he didn't believe in smoking. Whoa. And then, once again, that contributes to the nature of our hero. He is so different from the age of the Roaring Twenties. He was given $100,000 for a shaving commercial. He turned it down. He received $5 million in offers, all of which he turned down. These are all very, very interesting stories. He dined with the President of the United States, and so did his mother. He met with the President of France, the King of Poland, Belgium. I mean, this guy walked into instant stardom. He took the spirit of St. Louis across the United States and landed in every state and made a short little speech about aviation and the future of commercial aviation. But when he came to these cities, 25% of the entire American population came out to see him. They're all looking up there. And because he's landing his Spirit of St. Louis at the airport, and they came out to hear him give his little talk about aviation, the hero. When Charles Lindbergh, he was so famous that he would eat a corn cob in Iowa and throw it in the garbage. Girls would run after the corn cob and retrieve it, because this was a corn cob that was eaten by Charles Lindbergh. So this is what one author said: "The great, demanding, ever-pursuing, ever-present crowd, which if it could, in its insatiable curiosity, would leave untouched not a shred of his privacy, would tear his clothes apart, pluck hairs from his head, reach into every corner of his life, would suffocate him in its fever to possess him, the idol, the famous one, who had grown to fear his fame." So it's starting to change color, okay? So the name of my book is called Lindbergh Kidnapping, Mobs, Mass Psychology, and Myth. And it takes this extra dimension and goes with it. Okay, so when we talk about the kidnapping, in 1932, Charles Lindbergh was supposed to be at a dinner party, but he forgot, so he stayed at home. His baby was usually in another place with another relative on that Tuesday, and he was sick, so they kept him at home. Someone must have known, because the kidnapper put up a ladder and climbed the ladder to the nursery window and plucked the baby out. But Lindbergh was home reading a paper. His wife was home. The nanny was home. The butler was home, and there was a dog that mysteriously didn't bark. So it was a strange, amazing kidnapping. Now, that was a numinous moment. Just probably after the sinking of the Titanic, this is probably the second major numinous moment of the 20th century for the American people. Everyone remembered where they were, what they were doing, what was happening. Did you hear that the Lindbergh baby has been kidnapped? Oh my God. The mob seized. Newspaper production in the United States increased 20%. Everybody wanted to read about this story day in and day out. They couldn't get enough of it. 1 million Boy Scouts volunteered to search for the Lindbergh baby. Okay. Finally, 2 years later, a German named Bruno Richard Hauptmann is arrested. It's called the crime of the century. And they were getting ready for the trial, and the trial was the trial of the century. Again, newspapers were writing, and they were running out of things to say, but there was such an insatiable demand for copy, for stories, that sometimes they created their own stories. There was clearly a lynch mob mentality. When the courtroom proceedings were over, people would go into the courtroom and carve out a piece of the judge's bench as a souvenir, and pretty soon the judge had to eliminate people from the courtroom because they were just destroying the courtroom with souvenir seekers. So here's a short movie clip that sort of summarizes this whole story we've been talking
Death watch outside Trenton State Prison awaits the execution of Bruno Richard Hauptmann. He has been convicted of kidnapping and murdering this child, the firstborn son of Charles Lindbergh. Is doomed. On March 1st, 1932, the Lindbergh home is secretly entered through the second-floor nursery window. The sleeping Lindbergh baby is stolen from his crib. A makeshift wooden ladder was used to reach the child, while the Lindberghs were on the floor below. Within hours, the Lindbergh house in Hopewell, New Jersey is crowded with police. A ransom note demands $50,000 for the baby's safe return. Posters describing the 20-month-old baby are quickly circulated throughout the country. New York and New Jersey police are assigned to double shifts in an all-out search for the child. In New York City, first contact is made with the kidnappers by a retired school teacher named John F. Condon. Condon becomes a go-between in the attempt to recover the child.
The baby will be returned, I hope, in a short time. We are in contact and nobody is giving up.
A month after the kidnapping, Condon and Charles Lindbergh deliver $50,000 to a cemetery in the Bronx. The ransom is accepted, but the Lindbergh baby is not returned. 1 month later, near the Lindbergh estate, the baby's body is found. German carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Police search his house in the Bronx. In his garage, they find hidden nearly $15,000 of the Lindbergh ransom money. A long and frustrating search for the kidnapper of Lindbergh's child is finally over. Though the evidence against Hauptmann is totally circumstantial, authorities feel certain they've found. Thousands flock to what newspapers call the most sensational trial of the century. Though he hates the publicity, Lindbergh attends on every single day. David Willents heads the prosecution. The ladder used to reach the baby becomes the trial symbol and a major piece of evidence. An expert claims that it was partly constructed with wood from Hauptmann's attic. A panel of handwriting experts testify that Hauptmann's writing is identical to that in the ransom notes. The jury reaches its verdict in little more than 11 hours. As the news of Hauptmann's conviction is flashed around the world, his wife and his attorney make a final public appearance.
Mrs. Hauptmann, you still believe in the innocence of your husband, don't you?
I believe, and I know my husband is innocent. He did not kidnap the Lindbergh baby, and he did not murder the Lindbergh baby. I wish to appeal to the people of the United States to help me.
United Press, Trenton, Hauptmann executed, 8:47 1/2.
A morbid crowd outside the prison has gathered to watch the hearse leave.
So there's the story in brief. Now, if we take a look at the evidence against Hauptmann, this is a summary, and in a pretty long chapter in my book going over this stuff. So ransom money is found in his garage, about a third of it. Hauptmann said that he knew a friend, kind of a sleazy businessman named Isidore Fish. Isidore Fish had tuberculosis and went back to Germany, where he eventually died. He was only in his 20s, and he left a shoebox for Hauptmann, which Hauptmann diligently put up in his closet. He never opened up the package. 2 years after he heard that Fish died, he opened up the box because there was a storm and it got wet, and he found all this money in it. It was Lindbergh ransom money. Fish probably was laundering it. That's what Hauptmann said. But they said, no. Hauptmann had this money hidden in his garage, and he did have it hidden in his garage, and Hauptmann obviously was the killer. Similarities in Germanic handwriting for Hauptmann and the ransom notes were there. Hauptmann was a carpenter, and one of the boards from the ladder came from his attic. Hauptmann said, "I'm a carpenter. I got lumber all over my garage. Why would I go up to my attic and cut out a board to make one little piece of this ladder? Why would I do that?" But they matched a piece of wood from his attic to the ladder. There were eyewitnesses, not all that reliable, but some who said that they saw him in New Jersey. There was a sketch of a ladder, not the ladder, a ladder in his notebook. Well, that was interesting. If you kidnapped a baby and you had a sketch of a ladder, wouldn't you tear that page out if the whole world was looking for you? Well, there was a drawing of a ladder in his notebook. That man that you saw, Dr. Condon, who was the go-between, his phone number and address were scribbled on the inside of Hauptmann's closet. So, how incriminating. He had the telephone number and address of the ransom note contact in his closet. But again, if Hauptmann was the guilty person, why wouldn't he erase that after? I mean, they were looking for the kidnapper for 2 years. He already got the money. Why didn't he erase it from the inside of his closet? Final and most important was Charles Lindbergh. He didn't get the ransom money, but he was at that cemetery and he was listening. And he heard somebody say, "Hey, doctor, hey, doctor." And he thought that the voice that he heard was the same as Hauptmann's voice. And his testimony really sent Hauptmann to the electric chair, because if Charles Lindbergh, the hero, says that's the guy, then that's the guy. So what's the evidence? There were a couple of very interesting books that came out that said Hauptmann had nothing to do with this crime. Here are some evidence that, and it's much more thoroughly presented in the book. The guy who went to the cemetery to collect the money had a cough. Hauptmann didn't have a cough. Maybe he did at the time. But he had size 8.5 shoe, because they made plaster casts of the shoe print of what they called Cemetery John. Except Hauptmann's shoe size was larger by a size. Now, I can see a guy trying to disguise the size of his shoe by wearing larger sizes, but I can't see a guy trying to disguise the size of his shoe by wearing a smaller size. Hauptmann's shoe size was bigger than that. That evidence was not given to the defense at the trial. There were witnesses who were intimidated, including Dr. Condon, who wasn't quite sure Hauptmann was the man that he met in the cemetery. Hauptmann's best friend, Hans Kloppenberg, wanted to say that he was with Hauptmann on the night of the kidnapping in the Bronx or in Brooklyn. And he did not do well on the stand under the grueling attacks by the prosecutor, David Willens. There was evidence that was planted to make newspaper stories. A journalist said he wrote Condon's name and address on the inside of the closet because it made for good copy, and he wanted to frame this dirty criminal. So he wrote that on the closet. Hauptmann never did. There were no fingerprints of Hauptmann anywhere. There were 128 sets of fingerprints found on the kidnap ladder, but none of Hauptmann. Just before Hauptmann was executed, somebody mailed a package to the New Jersey State Police, which no one paid any attention to. Someone in 1950 who was researching this crime found it. Now, the ransom notes had punctured holes in them, so that there were so many people trying to collect money from the ransom. They had nothing to do with kidnapping. The kidnappers had a code that only the police knew, so they could always tell if the ransom note was authentic. It had a symbol, and it had 3 punched holes in it. And each of the holes, there are 13 ransom notes, and they all fit on top of these, the holes all lined up. So the person who mailed this package to the New Jersey State Police mailed the nail assembly that all of the ransom notes fit over the top of this machine, so that whoever sent that machine was probably the real kidnapper. And certainly Hauptmann was in jail. He didn't send the machine to anybody. So the machine that made the ransom notes appears in 1950. They knew about it. If somebody had opened the package, maybe Hauptmann would have been exonerated. Finally, there are extremely weird events here that just completely get dismissed. How did Hauptmann know that baby was going to be there on Tuesday night? All of the windows of the Lindbergh house could be locked, except the nursery window, which was broken, and it was going to be repaired in 3 weeks. How did Hauptmann know when to go up to that nursery room? Lindbergh's reading his newspaper. He's not supposed to be home. Somebody on the inside had to signal him that it was okay. The baby was sick. When the lights went out, is that when the kidnapper moved? He moved his ladder. Why didn't the dog bark? Oliver Whately, the butler, was in charge of the dog. Why didn't the dog bark? Lindbergh heard a funny noise outside and then dismissed it. When the guy was putting up the ladder, he heard a noise, but he didn't do anything about it. So here are some of the very strange events here. After the baby's body was found, Isidor Fish suddenly applies to leave the country. According to Hauptmann, he's the guy who had the laundered ransom money, or part of it. And he also had tuberculosis. And he could have easily been Cemetery John. He was frail, and he was smaller than Hauptmann. It's doubtful if he was the kidnapper. He was just too weak to do that. Violet Sharp was a maid in the Lindbergh household. She kills herself. She's 28 years old. She kills herself by taking cyanide 2 days after the baby's body was found. She was going to be interrogated by the police, and she was very nervous. And she goes up and kills herself? Really? And you dismiss that as irrelevant? Hauptmann didn't know Violet Sharp. She could have been the inside person. She had a sister whose name was Edna, and Edna applied for a passport the day that the baby's body was found. Oh, there goes Edna, too. Henry Leopold kills himself. Henry Leopold was caught passing Lindbergh ransom money before Hauptmann was ever arrested. Hauptmann didn't know him. He was going to be, they were tracking him down because they found that he was passing Lindbergh ransom money, and he kills himself. Whoa. Lindbergh's butler dies. Oliver Whately was in charge of the dog. He dies an untimely death within a year. He was a young man. I think he was in his 40s. All of these things get forgotten about as soon as Hauptmann is arrested. They don't continue getting investigated. So, okay, conspiracy theorists have a heyday here on this one. Now, there are some really telling psychological reasons why Hauptmann was innocent. Okay, he said he found the ransom money 2 years afterwards, and these were gold certificates. They were going out of circulation. They were becoming increasingly rare. He started spending the money. That's how he got caught. He said Fish owed him money. Fish is dead. I found this box of all this money, and he paid his rent with this money. Why? What kind of an idiot would pay his rent with traceable gold certificates, which were ransom money? Why would Hauptmann do that? He had to be retarded to do that. He went shopping in his own neighborhood, spending Lindbergh ransom money. When he bought gasoline in a station, the guy said, "Oh my God, you got a gold certificate." And he said, "Yeah, I've got more of those at home." Now, why would a guilty person who was on the lam say things like that and incriminate himself unless he didn't have any idea he was dealing with ransom money? When the governor of New Jersey didn't believe he was guilty, but 17 Princeton University professors said, "You have to execute him. It's your constitutional duty." So he said to Hauptmann, "Okay, you couldn't have done this crime by yourself. And all the planning that goes into it. If you name your co-conspirators, we will spare your life. You will get life in prison. You will not be executed in the electric chair." And Hauptmann said, "I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I don't have any co-conspirators." Leibowitz, a famous flamboyant attorney, said, I can get a confession out of anybody. And he was given permission to interview Hauptmann in prison before he was electrocuted. And he got absolutely nowhere with Hauptmann. Hauptmann said, I didn't do it, I didn't do it. He was offered $90,000 to write an article to an exclusive publication that would give $90,000 to his wife and baby. And he didn't. He was even shaved for placing electrodes on his body to be electrocuted. His lawyer said, there's no more reprieves, no more time. Don't you have anything to say about this? He said, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. Okay, now there are people who write to me and say they think Hauptmann did do it. So if you read the book, I don't think you can walk away with that feeling. So this story doesn't end here. You'd think it would end here, but it's not true. Hauptmann is executed in 1936, but mob rule continues. Mass psychology continues. Lindbergh has a second child, and they're driving the child to nursery school, and journalists stop the car and stick their heads in and take photographs of his second child. And he said, we can't do this anymore. This country is crazy. He and his wife packed up their kids. They took out a boat. No one knew it. And they went off to England, and they stayed in England for 3 years just to avoid the mobs. It was not going to end. They were going to still be persecuted. In England, they were not persecuted by the mobs, and they had, for the first time in their lives, some privacy. So the Lindberghs leave the country, and Lindbergh becomes interested in Joseph Kennedy, John Kennedy's father, who was an ambassador, an isolationist. And Lindbergh is asked by the United States government to go to Nazi Germany and report for the government on the status of Nazi aviation. He does, and of course the Germans love Lindbergh, and he goes under the aegis of the American Embassy. He goes to a dinner, and there he is given a medal, quite to his surprise, and it's a swastika-laden medal. And he accepts the medal. He's not going to throw it in their face. He was trying to be polite for the American government. But the story comes back to America that Lindbergh accepted a Nazi swastika medal. What kind of a person is he? So finally, Lindbergh comes back in 1939. People wanted him to run for president against Roosevelt. He was a Midwestern isolationist. And he didn't want the United States to get involved in World War II. And he said, they're pushing and pushing and pushing for us to get involved, and we're going to be risking American lives. So he makes a speech in Des Moines. Notice the date, September 11th. September 11th is a very important date in American collective psychology. It's the day that the Pentagon they broke ground to build the Pentagon. But also, Lindbergh's heroism comes to an end on September 11th, 1941. He comes and he's part of the American First campaign. Like, America first. We don't want to go to war with Germany. He makes this terrible speech, and he gets terrible publicity from it. Here is a bit of that speech.
In selecting these three groups as the major agitators for war, I have included only those whose support is essential to the war party. If any of these groups, the British, the Jewish, or the administration, stops agitating for war, I believe there will be little danger of our involvement. I do.
So, Lindy makes a boo-boo. He says the Jewish, and as soon as he says the Jewish, there's tremendous outcry in the press against Lindbergh. And they remember him receiving that medal from the Nazis, and all of a sudden he becomes an image of an anti-Semitic person. And his star fades. His star absolutely fades. And when Pearl Harbor happens, it turns out that Lindbergh's isolationism is proved wrong, and he's proved wrong, and that's the end of that story. Now, Lindbergh himself was a very loyal American. And when he realized he was wrong and that we had to go to war, that Roosevelt would not allow him to enlist. So he secretly went off to the Pacific and fought the war as a civilian pilot for the Air Force until Roosevelt found out about it and got him out of there. But actually, Lindbergh flew combat missions for the United States in World War II. So now, I had a graduate student many, many years ago who did a paper for me in a class, and I thought, and it was on this subject, and I said, Trudy, that is really an amazing idea. That you've got to develop that. So she went on to get a PhD, but developed a mysterious cancer which was not able to be cured, and she died. And she never finished that project, and it was always on her back burner. And I said to her before she passed away, I said, hey, can I put some flesh and blood and meat and bones on your idea? Because I think it's a very interesting, it is a weird idea, but it is a great idea. She said, please do. So this is kind of dedicated to her. I spent 2 or 3 years doing this, but this idea really comes from her. And it's a psychological interpretation, and it's going to take you into another world. So get ready. Okay, we have a few terms to talk about here. Projection, numinosity, transference, projective vessel. And we're going to do a number on this story. Okay, so Jung and Joseph Campbell tell us that a dream is like a myth is like a dream. A myth is a public dream, a dream is a private myth. And the Lindbergh story is a story out there in history. Most people who write to me are detectives. They're realists. They want to know about the handwriting similarities or this or that, and they're interested in all these years later in who done it. Nobody particularly cares in that group of people about why was there so much craziness and mob psychology going on. No one even addresses that issue. But this has all the status of an American myth. So let's talk a little more about numinosity. If collective psychology and psychology was not involved in this story, and we could just dismiss it as irrelevant, well, there's a guy named Clarence Chamberlain. He flew across the Atlantic a couple months after Lindbergh. He beat Lindbergh's distance record. He's no one. No one paid any attention to him. He's not famous. Why did he get not even a little bit of the attention that Lindbergh? He did a solo flight across the Atlantic 2 months later. Why does Lindbergh get all of the attention and not Clarence Chamberlain? And everyone said, oh, this is a brand new, it's a first for aviation. No, a team of flyers flew from Newfoundland to Ireland 7 years before Lindbergh. What was the big deal about Lindbergh? He did it alone. He touched an archetype, a single American individualist, young, opportunistic, curious, and adventurous. That's the nature of the American essence. That was part of the psychological archetype that was being unleashed here. Psychology was involved. So I wanted to compare the Rolling Stones to Lindbergh because I wanted to look up the biggest rock tour in the 20th century. I went to the Guinness Book of World Records. What was the biggest rock tour in the United States in the 20th century? And it was the Rolling Stones counted around 1990, in the 90s, and they grossed like $500 million. Okay, so that is Lindbergh bigger than the biggest rock star of the 20th century? Absolutely. 1 in 150 Americans came out to see the Rolling Stones perform during that tour of theirs. Compare that to Charles Lindbergh. 1 in 4 Americans came out to see Lindbergh when he did his tour of the United States. Lindbergh's psychological power was 30 times greater than the biggest rock star in the 20th century that crossed the American landscape. That's how powerful a psychological icon Lindbergh was. Even just to show you the mob psychology, the jury that convicted Hauptmann went on tour. They went on a vaudeville tour across the country and appeared in Chicago in nightclubs. And they had arranged some kind of a show around them, and they made money advertising themselves as one of the jurors who sent Hauptmann to the electric chair. So if we look at, again, at numinosity a little, JFK had this quality too. Americans were asked to rank the presidents in terms of the best presidents of the United States. JFK ranks third, right after George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. He ranks third. Historians have been asked to rank the presidents, and Kennedy comes out like 35th. What did he do? He almost got us blown up at the Cuban Missile Crisis. He got the Peace Corps. He tried to do something about civil rights, but he wasn't successful. And he was the most sexually dysfunctional president in American history. So historians don't rank him highly, but the American people do. They fell in love. They were absolutely taken by it. So what was it? What is the Kennedy mystique that made everybody so gaga? Well, it's partly, people have speculated about this. Maybe it's the fact that we yearn for royalty, and we're tired of Uncle Sam. We'd like to have a prince or a king or a queen, and we had something like that when the Kennedys were in the White House. Well, we don't quite know about the nature of their numinosity. Now let's take another example. O.J. Simpson. There he is on the cover of Time magazine, a pretty good football player and a second-rate actor. But he murders his wife, or allegedly murders his wife and her suitor, and she's a white woman. And the O.J. Simpson trial took on mob proportions, just like Hauptmann did. All television programs seemed to be canceled. My mother was in her 90s at the time. She loved Regis and Kathy. And that was taken off because every single morning we saw Judge Ito and Marcia Clark prosecuting O.J. for the murder. It was on television all day long, all soap operas. This was the living American soap opera. Why? Why did O.J. Simpson get so much attention? Okay? People have speculated about that, but it's amazing how few did. Everybody was concerned with who did it, is he guilty, is he not guilty, da-da-da, and nobody was interested in the fact that Americans are obsessed. They can't get enough of this. Isn't somebody going to write an article about mass psychology here? Because there it is, right in front of you every single day. What is happening? This is completely unconscious. Robert Blake was an actor. He was a much better actor than O.J. Simpson, and he allegedly murdered his wife, shot her outside of a restaurant. And he had a trial, and he was acquitted. He got almost no publicity at all. What is it that made O.J. Simpson this story so magical? Robert Blake didn't make the cover of Time magazine, okay? Why? So, if you start looking at this as a Jungian myth, as a numinous dream, and you say, the job is to find out the meaning of the numinosity. What is the meaning? What is archetypal here? Well, the O.J. story had almost everything to do with race. Here's a black man married to a white woman. Here's a white woman prosecuting a black man. The whole trial comes down to a policeman who finds a bloody glove. And he's a white policeman, which is having the most incriminating evidence against O.J. And an attorney says, have you ever used the N-word in the last 5 years? Have you used the N-word? And he said, no. And then he produced a recording showing that this man, this policeman, the white policeman, really did use the N-word numerous times. And he was lying on the stand. Well, if he was lying about the N-word, is he lying about the bloody glove? Reasonable doubt. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. O.J. walks. Okay? Now, there was a poll done of Americans. 60% of African Americans thought O.J. was innocent. 68% of white Americans thought he was guilty. That is a racial divide, okay? The O.J. story, I think, has something to do with the fact that America's racial divisions are much more deeply rooted than we are aware of, or that we allow ourselves to believe. They are far deeper than we think. So this picture, a picture says 1,000 words. Here it is. This is the moment at an integrated college campus that the verdict is read, OJ is acquitted. Now take a careful look at that picture. Okay, look at the white people. They are all in a state of shock. Nobody's smiling. Oh my God, is what they're saying. And look at the black people in that picture. They're cheering. Okay, they're vindicated. This is a story about America. It is not a story about O.J. Simpson. This is a story about what that was acted out on the stage of history, about having to portray America's racial issues. So if you look at this story of Lindbergh as a dream, like a film, we're going and having a coffee, and we're going to try to figure out the meaning of this event in American history as if it was a movie, a play, a tragedy. So we have three periods: the Hour of Gold, 1927 to 32, where he's a famous hero. He lands in Paris at 27. Then these are terms that Anne Lindbergh, his wife, used. The Hour of Lead, from 1932 to 36. This is when the Great Depression hits. You know, and some people have read, hey, Lindbergh is high when America is high in the 20s. When America falls into a depression, Lindbergh's life falls into a depression. Kidnapping, the execution of Hauptmann. And finally, the final stage, prodigal son, exile and infamy. He goes away to England and comes back and is perceived as a pro-Nazi infidel. Now, Lindbergh falls out of favor in as of September 11th, 1941. The number of articles written about Lindbergh in the next 17 years do not equal the number of articles written about Lindbergh in 1941. So his journey as a hero ends on September 11th, okay? The war begins. The Lindbergh myth ends and World War II begins. Very interesting. So if we look at this 14-year story as a collective psychodrama, in Act 1 of this play, we have Prometheus, a god who enters on stage. In Act 2, we have public enemy number 1 of this world. That's what he was called, Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Okay, he's the star of Act 2 of this 3-act play. And in the 3rd act, Lindbergh comes back on stage as an anti-Semitic infidel who seems to have lost his loyalty to his country. So that's how we're having our lattes and we're thinking about this and we're seeing it as a movie acted out on the stage of history. Now, you're not going to believe this, but there in this film myth that we're looking at, there's just like the O.J. Simpson story was full of black and white symbolism. Well, there is just a panorama of German Jewish symbolism in this play. For example, someone, before Lindbergh takes off in the spirit of St. Louis, they sketch a swastika on the propeller. It was since removed, but it was a sign of good luck then. So a swastika appears in Act 1 of this play on the propeller of the Spirit of St. Louis. The investigator who is going to catch the dastardly criminal Bruno Hauptmann happened to be German. His name was Schwarzkopf. The killer of the Lindbergh baby was German. The prosecutor of the dastardly criminal was David Willens, who is Jewish. The scapegoat. Jews have always historically played the role of a scapegoat. Well, Bruno Richard Hauptmann said, Isidor Fish gave me the money. I didn't have anything to do with it, but he probably did. And he's dead. So the scapegoat in this play is played by Isidor Fish, Jewish. The psychoanalyst who was helping the police figure out the personality traits of the kidnapper. This is before he ever met Hauptmann. His name was Schoenfeld. He's Jewish. And the medal that was given to, at the final act of the play, the medal given to Lindbergh as a surprise at this American Embassy dinner is adorned with swastikas. So these German Jewish symbols are all over this whole story. I didn't give a summary of all of them in this video, but they're in the book. It's amazing. They're all over this place. What is the connection between the Lindbergh kidnapping and German Jewish, huh? Okay, but it's there. It's clearly there. So you have to ask yourself, this is called the crime of the century. Really? Really? What really was the crime of the 20th century? Could it be World War II? Now, when you have a dream, you're supposed to take the theme out of the dream and say, how does this theme relate to the rest of my life? Well, the theme in this Act 2 is a German attempts to blame a Jew for his fate. Where have I heard that before? A German attempts to blame a Jew for his fate. Hauptmann attempted to blame Isidor Fish. But the theme here, the meta theme, is German attempts to blame a Jew for his fate. Have we heard that before in the 20th century? Now, these are all terms that were used to describe Hauptmann. So let's say you had a dream, and you had a character in the dream, and all these terms fit this, and you say, wait a minute, I dreamt about Mother Teresa, and I had all these terms about, these were such negative terms about Mother Teresa. Well, after you wake up and you think about this dream, maybe those terms apply to someone else, not Mother Teresa. So who do these terms apply to? The search for the criminal of the century, public enemy number one of this world, venomous, cold-blooded, a tyrant, devoid of the commonest human emotions, ruthless, a person of German descent. Who could that be? A deep-seated sense of omnipotence. An egomaniac. Life meant nothing to him. He was possibly childless. Who could it be? All right. Now, we're talking about projection, transference, and projective vessels here. Give me a chance to develop this thought. Do you remember the movie Fatal Attraction? The name of Glenn Close's character, but she falls in love with Michael Douglas, who's married and has a kid. And she becomes totally obsessed with him, has to possess him. He's God's gift to mankind. He's great. He doesn't even know he's great. He's just something that she must have, and if she doesn't have it, she'll die or kill herself or kill him. And she's nuts, okay? So this is a movie about her obsession with Michael Douglas. So the idea of projection here is that Michael Douglas was just a schmo in this movie. He was a married man who had a kid. He was no god. He was not rich. He was not famous. He was just a nobody. But she made him into something. She made him bigger than life, larger than life. When you see something that's bigger than life and larger than life, it's a projection. This is not a movie about relationship between Glenn Close and Michael Douglas. It's a movie about the relationship between Glenn Close and Glenn Close, between Glenn Close and her unconscious and her craziness and her issues, which she projects into Michael Douglas. Michael Douglas is a projected vessel which receives all of the unconscious junk that is thrown at it. He isn't that person, okay? He's a projection. So he is just a vessel into which Glenn Close's unconscious contents get spewed. This is how we look at the Lindbergh myth, too. Or this is how we could look at it. So, ask yourself a question. Was Charles Lindbergh in 1927 really Prometheus? Was he really a god? No, he was a 28-year-old guy who liked flying, had no idea what he was doing or what he was in for. Okay, he was smart. He was a daredevil. He was no god. He was no rock star. He was selected by the American unconscious to play out a role for us, for them. Was Bruno Richard Hauptmann really egomaniacal, venomous, ruthless, tyrannical, conscienceless, possessed by feelings of omnipotence, possibly childless? Those were the terms used by the prosecutor during the trial and by the psychoanalyst. No, Richard Bruno Hauptmann was a carpenter from the Bronx who was married to Anna Hauptmann. He got in trouble in Germany, and when he came to America, he promised his mother back in Germany he would never get in trouble again. He was happily married. He saved his money. He had $12,000. He was not poor. He did not need to kidnap the Lindbergh baby. He had just bought a brand new car and driven across the country in his car before any kidnapping. He was a father. He just had a brand new baby. It's very difficult for a man who is a little baby to go out and kill somebody else's baby. Okay? He was selected to play out this role on stage, on our collective stage. And he was a victim of it, too. The final question here is, was Charles Lindbergh in Act 3 really a silver-shirted, anti-Semitic Nazi lover and an American infidel? No. Charles Lindbergh was a Midwestern isolationist. He was very nonviolent. He was interested in ecology. He wrote books. He didn't write any anti-Semitic tracts about anybody. He made one boo-boo of his speech. He didn't want the Jewish lobby, as he called it, to push us into World War II. But when World War II came around, he fought for his country. He never wrote right-wing anti-Semitic anythings. He was basically a non-person for years. He was interested in ecology and the environment and Philippines peoples. And I think President Kennedy rehabilitated him in the 60s and invited him to the White House. But he was happy not to, but he didn't fit nobody fit the roles that they were ascribed in this play. So it is important to recognize that Hauptmann is innocent, in the same way that it's important to recognize that Michael Douglas was just an average guy, okay? Because once you know that Hauptmann is innocent, then you know that all the things that are attributed to Hauptmann have to do with the people who are attributing them to Hauptmann, okay? It means that projection is going on. The subtext and this theme of this psychodrama is that a German blames a Jew for his fate. Who was the greatest criminal of the 20th century? Adolf Hitler, not Bruno Richard Hauptmann. What was the greatest crime of the 20th century? World War II, not the kidnapping of a baby in New Jersey. Okay? A lot of people died in World War II. It was the biggest, it was the most evil moment of the human race. Well, you cannot find a single incident in the history of humankind where the extermination and murder of so many people, premeditated murder, occurred. In Auschwitz, 1 million people were exterminated on this acreage. And I don't think there is another site in the entire history of the human race that can say this killing field is bigger than Auschwitz was. Okay? The symbolic crime of the century, the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby, pointed to the real crime of the century, World War II. This is a preposterous idea. But the real crime of the century involved 6 million people who were exterminated and 69 million people dead. Now let's read the terms used against Hauptmann and see if they fit somebody else. Okay, these are all terms at the bottom of this picture that were used to describe Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Now you try to put those terms on Adolf Hitler, and it is an absolutely perfect fit. Child killer, totally. The worst criminal of the century, totally. Public enemy #1 of this world, absolutely. Cold, devoid of the commonest human emotions, panther-like, omnipotent, the filthiest and vilest snake that ever crawled through the grass, a venomous devil, an animal lower than the lowest form of the animal kingdom, a wiry person, yes, a person of German descent, absolutely, although he was Austrian, ruthless, conscienceless, a deep-seated sense of omnipotence, completely, tyrannical, an egomaniac. Life meant nothing to him, possibly childless. Yes, Hitler was childless, but Hauptmann wasn't. Isn't that interesting? So here's a conclusion, and I admit this is extremely controversial, but put it in there in your little thought bag. Okay, as the O.J. Simpson epic was a symbolic tale which reflected unconscious collective feelings about race and racism, acted out on the stage of history. Do you follow that? Do you agree with that? So too was the Lindbergh epic a symbolic tale about America's unconscious collective fears about the prospect of a coming world conflagration. a mythic tale similarly acted out on the stage of history. It's like an anticipatory dream, as if the American psyche is getting itself ready and is anticipating a great collective Holocaust. And the whole Lindbergh epic is like a rehearsal of that. Well, that's the story, and I want to thank Trudy Burroughs for this idea.